Have you ever seen 10,000 angry people fall completely silent because of a single song? Chicago, Illinois, September 1949. The Civic Opera House was about to witness the most explosive confrontation in jazz history. An organized racist mob had gathered outside with signs, rocks, and hate-filled chants, determined to prevent Billie Holiday from performing. But what happened when she walked onto that stage would shock everyone in attendance and force an entire city to confront its own conscience. If you love discovering the untold stories behind music history's most incredible moments, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification bell because we uncover the hidden gems that shape the legends we know today. Chicago Civic Opera House, September 23, 1949, 6:30 p.m. The venue was elegant, prestigious, the kind of place where Chicago's cultural elite gathered for refined entertainment. Tonight's booking was unusual. Billie Holiday, performing with a full jazz orchestra for an integrated audience. It was exactly the kind of event that certain groups in Chicago had been organizing to prevent. Outside the Opera House, a crowd of approximately 300 white protesters had been gathering since 4 p.m. They carried signs reading "Whites Only," "Keep Chicago Pure," and "Stop the Mixing." The demonstration had been organized by the Chicago Preservation Society, a group that claimed to protect traditional American values by opposing racial integration in public venues. The leader of the protest was a man named Robert Kellerman, a 38-year-old insurance agent who'd appointed himself spokesman for what he called concerned white citizens. Kellerman had been planning this demonstration for weeks, ever since the Opera House announced Billie Holiday's performance. "We're not against music," Kellerman told reporters who'd gathered to cover the protest. "We're against the degradation of our cultural institutions. This woman represents everything that's wrong with modern entertainment. The drugs, the immorality, the race mixing. We won't stand for it." By 7 p.m., the crowd outside had grown to nearly 500 people. Some carried Confederate flags. Others held signs with Billie's photograph crossed out in red. A few had brought rocks and bottles, though they insisted they were only there to peacefully protest. Inside the Opera House, 2,400 ticket holders had arrived for the performance. The audience was roughly 60% white, 40% black, with people from all over Chicago and surrounding areas. Many had driven hours to see Billie perform in such a prestigious venue. The contrast was stark. Outside, angry faces, raised voices, signs demanding exclusion. Inside, an integrated audience of music lovers, waiting quietly for an artist they paid to see perform. At 7:15, police estimated that over 800 protesters had gathered outside. Some were chanting "Send her back." Others were singing "America the Beautiful," with specially modified lyrics that included racial slurs. The demonstration was becoming increasingly aggressive. Inside, ticket holders could hear the commotion outside. Some looked nervous. Others seemed determined to ignore the protest and focus on the music they'd come to hear. Chicago police had assigned 12 officers to monitor the situation, but they seemed unprepared for the size and intensity of the crowd that had assembled. At 7:30, Billie Holiday's car pulled up to the stage entrance on the side of the building. She was scheduled to perform at 8 p.m., and she always arrived 30 minutes early to prepare. The protesters spotted the car immediately. Within seconds, hundreds of people were pressing toward the stage entrance, shouting, waving signs, some throwing objects at the vehicle. Billie sat in the back seat, looking out at the crowd through the car window. She'd seen angry white faces before, but never this many, never this organized, never this close. Her manager, Joe Glazer, was in the car beside her. "Billie, we don't have to do this tonight. We can reschedule. This is getting dangerous." "How many people bought tickets?" Billie asked quietly. "It's sold out. 2,400. And they're inside waiting for me?" "Yes, but then I'm performing." Police officers escorted Billie from her car to the backstage entrance. As she walked the 20 feet to the door, protesters screamed at her, called her names, threw pieces of trash in her direction. Billie didn't look at them. She kept her eyes straight ahead, moving with dignity through the gauntlet of hate. Once inside, she could still hear the crowd outside. Their chants were audible even through the Opera House's thick walls. "Miss Holiday," the venue manager approached her nervously, "we're having some difficulties outside. If you'd prefer to postpone tonight's performance. What kind of difficulties? A rather large group of protesters. They seem quite upset about tonight's show. Are the people who bought tickets inside? Yes, ma'am. The audience is seated and ready. Then let's give them what they paid for. At 8 p.m. the house lights dimmed. Outside, the protest had grown to over 1,000 people. Inside, 2,400 audience members settled into their seats, aware of the commotion outside but focused on the stage. The announcer's voice filled the opera house. Ladies and gentlemen, the Chicago Civic Opera House presents Miss Billie Holiday. The curtain rose. Billie walked onto the stage wearing an elegant black evening gown, her gardenia in her hair, moving with the poise of someone who belonged exactly where she was. The audience erupted in applause. Not polite applause but enthusiastic, defiant applause. They were applauding not just Billie, but the fact that she was there despite the hate gathering outside. Billie approached the microphone. For a moment she stood silently, looking out at the integrated audience. People of different races sitting together in one of Chicago's most prestigious venues, united by their appreciation for music. Good evening, Billie said simply. Thank you for coming out tonight. More applause. The audience was with her completely. Billie began with What a Little Moonlight Can Do, a song that usually made audiences smile. Her voice filled the opera house, clear and strong and beautiful. For those 8 minutes it was easy to forget about the anger outside. But everyone could still hear them. The chanting, the shouting, the sound of people who wanted to stop this moment from happening. After the first song, Billie looked out at the audience again. Some of you might be wondering about our visitors outside, she said calmly. They seem to have some strong opinions about tonight's show. A few nervous laughs from the audience. They're exercising their right to free speech, Billie continued. And we're exercising ours. The difference is we bought tickets. Stronger laughter. The audience was relaxing, following Billie's lead in treating the situation with dignity rather than fear. Outside, the crowd was becoming more agitated. Some protesters were trying to push past police barriers, demanding entry to the building. Others were shouting that the performance should be stopped, that integrated audiences were illegal, that Billie had no right to perform in such a venue. Robert Kellerman, the protest leader, had taken position directly outside the opera house's main entrance. He was shouting through a megaphone, trying to organize the crowd's anger. This is our city, Kellerman yelled. This is our culture. We will not let it be contaminated by inferior elements. Inside, Billie continued her performance. She sang Lover Man, then God Bless the Child. With each song the audience became more engaged, more supportive, more defiant of the hate outside. But Billie could hear the protesters getting louder, more aggressive. She could see tension in some audience members' faces. The beautiful music was being shadowed by ugly voices from outside. After her fifth song, Billie made a decision that would change everything. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, I'd like to sing something special for our friends outside. A song that I think speaks to this moment. She nodded to the orchestra conductor. The musicians looked uncertain. They hadn't rehearsed what she was about to perform. I'm going to sing this alone, Billie said. No accompaniment. I want everyone to be able to hear every word. The opera house fell completely silent. 2,400 people waiting. Billie stepped closer to the microphone and began to sing Strange Fruit. Southern trees bear a strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root. The effect was immediate and devastating. Billie's voice, unaccompanied, filled every corner of the opera house. The song's lyrics about lynching, about racial violence, about the cost of hate, seemed to pierce through the building's walls. Outside, something extraordinary began to happen. The protesters could hear Billie singing. Her voice was carrying through the building, audible even to the crowd in the street. At first, they tried to shout over her. But Billie's voice was too powerful, too clear, too impossible to ignore. Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. Some of the protesters stopped chanting. They were hearing the lyrics, understanding what she was singing about. A song about people who looked like Billie being murdered simply because of their race. Here is fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to suck. More protesters fell silent. Not because they agreed with the song, but because they were confronted with something they hadn't expected. Instead of entertainment or celebration, they were hearing testimony. Instead of performance, they were hearing witness. Inside the opera house, the audience was completely still. Some people were crying. Others sat frozen, absorbing the power of what they were experiencing. For the sun to rot, for the trees to drop, here is a strange and bitter crop. When Billie finished, the silence stretched for nearly a minute. No one in the opera house moved. No one outside spoke. Then slowly the applause began. Not enthusiastic applause, but deep, respectful applause. The kind reserved for moments when art transcends entertainment and becomes something essential. Outside, the protest was fracturing. Some people were leaving, walking away from the demonstration. Others stood silently, processing what they'd heard. Robert Kellerman tried to rally his supporters. "Don't let her manipulate you," he shouted through his megaphone. "This is exactly what they do. They use emotion to cloud your judgment." But the energy of the protest had changed. People who'd come to prevent Billie from singing had just heard her sing about the consequences of hatred. Some were questioning why they were there. Inside, Billie approached the microphone again. "That song," she said quietly, "is about what happens when people decide that other people don't deserve to exist safely. It's about the cost of believing that some human beings are worth less than others." The audience listened intently. "Tonight, some people outside believe I don't belong on this stage. They believe that you don't belong in those seats. They believe that music should divide people instead of bringing them together." Billie's voice remained calm, but her words carried weight. "I'm not here to change anyone's mind about race. I'm not here to argue politics. I'm here to sing songs. But I want everyone to understand something. Music doesn't know color. Music doesn't care about your background. Music only cares about truth. The people outside are exercising their right to hate. But you're exercising your right to love. And love is always stronger than hate, even when hate is louder." Outside, more protesters were leaving. The crowd that had numbered over 1,000 at its peak was beginning to thin. Some people seemed confused about why they were there. Others appeared uncomfortable with the increasingly aggressive tone of the remaining demonstrators. Kellerman was becoming desperate. His carefully organized protest was falling apart. "Don't leave," he pleaded with departing protesters. "This is exactly what they want. They want to divide us, to make us feel guilty about protecting our values." But people continued to walk away. Not necessarily because they'd changed their minds about integration, but because they'd heard something that made the evening's hate feel inappropriate, unnecessary. Billie continued her performance for another hour. She sang love songs, blues songs, jazz standards. The audience was completely engaged, supportive, transformed by the evening's events. When she finished her final song, the standing ovation lasted nearly 10 minutes. It wasn't just appreciation for the music. It was gratitude for her courage, for her dignity, for her refusal to be intimidated. As audience members began to leave the opera house, they encountered a much smaller protest outside. Maybe 200 people remained, and they seemed deflated, uncertain. Some audience members, both black and white, stopped to talk with protesters. Not to argue or confront, but to ask questions. "Why were you here tonight? What were you hoping to accomplish? Did you hear any of the music?" These conversations didn't change minds immediately, but they planted seeds. They forced people on both sides to see each other as individuals rather than representatives of opposing groups. Robert Kellerman left the protest around 10:30 p.m., frustrated and defeated. His organized demonstration had been undermined not by police force or counter-protesters, but by a jazz singer's voice carrying truth through stone walls. In the following days, Chicago newspapers covered the event extensively. Some focused on the protest, others on the performance. But most coverage acknowledged that something significant had happened. A moment when art had diffused hate, when music had spoken louder than anger. The Chicago Tribune interviewed several people who'd attended both the protest and the concert. "I went there to support traditional values," one former protester said. "I left questioning whether what I was supporting was actually valuable. I heard that song about lynching," another said. "It made me think about what we were really protesting. Were we protesting music? Or were we protesting a person's right to exist and work?" Not everyone was changed by the evening. Some protesters maintained their positions, argued that they'd been manipulated by emotional performance. Some insisted that integration remained wrong regardless of how beautifully it was presented. But cracks had formed in the certainty of organized hate. Questions had been planted about whether their cause was just, whether their methods were effective, whether their enemy was actually threatening the things they claimed to protect. Billie Holiday never spoke publicly about the Chicago protest. When asked by reporters, she simply said, "I went there to sing songs for people who wanted to hear them. That's what I did." But people who were there that night, both supporters and protesters, remembered it for the rest of their lives. They remembered the moment when a single voice singing about pain and truth had more power than 1,000 voices shouting about hate and fear. The Chicago Civic Opera House continued to host integrated performances. The success of Billie's concert, despite the protest, demonstrated that there was an audience for integrated entertainment, that people of all backgrounds could come together around shared appreciation for art. Other venues in Chicago began booking Black performers for integrated audiences. Club owners discovered that diversity could be profitable, that drawing from wider audiences meant better business. The Chicago Preservation Society, the group that organized the protest, disbanded 6 months later. Robert Kellerman moved to a smaller town outside Chicago, telling neighbors that the city had become too liberal for his values. But several former members of the group remained in Chicago and gradually became less involved in racial activism. They didn't necessarily embrace integration, but they stopped actively organizing against it. Years later, some would admit that hearing Strange Fruit that night had forced them to consider the human cost of the racism they'd been promoting. They'd come to stop a singer and had been confronted with the reality of what their beliefs actually meant in practice. One former protester, speaking anonymously to a journalist in the 1960s, said, "I went there thinking she was the problem. But after hearing that song, I started wondering if maybe we were the problem." The story of Billie Holiday's Chicago performance became part of jazz history, but more importantly, it became part of the ongoing story of how art can challenge hate, how truth can penetrate prejudice, and how a single voice singing about justice can be stronger than 1,000 voices shouting about fear. In 1975, the Chicago Civic Opera House installed a plaque commemorating the evening. It reads simply, "On this stage in 1949, music proved stronger than hate." Today, when people ask about the most powerful performances in the venue's history, Billie Holiday's September 23rd concert is always mentioned. Not because of its technical perfection, but because of its moral courage. Because of what it proved about the power of art to speak truth in the face of organized hatred. Sometimes the most important victories happen not through confrontation, but through simply doing the work you came to do. Billie Holiday came to Chicago to sing songs. Despite the hate outside, despite the danger, despite the pressure to cancel, she sang songs. And in doing so, she demonstrated something that her protesters couldn't understand. That the best response to hate is not more hate, but the continued creation of beauty, truth, and shared human connection. The impact of that September night extended far beyond Chicago. Word of what had happened spread throughout the jazz community, then through the broader civil rights movement. The story became a template for how to respond to organized hatred, not with violence or confrontation, but with dignity and the continued pursuit of one's work. Other Black performers facing similar protests began adopting what became known as the Chicago approach, acknowledging the hatred while refusing to be deterred by it, using art to speak truth rather than engaging in political argument. But perhaps the most lasting impact was on the audience members who witnessed the event. Many of them went on to become civil rights activists, not because they'd been convinced by political arguments, but because they'd experienced the power of integration firsthand. They'd sat in an audience where race didn't matter, where people came together around shared appreciation for artistic excellence. Sarah Mitchell, a white audience member who'd attended the concert as a young woman, later became a civil rights organizer in Mississippi. In interviews, she always traced her activism to that September night in Chicago. "I grew up in a segregated world," Mitchell recalled. "I'd been taught that integration was dangerous, that it would lead to chaos and conflict. But that night in the Opera House, I looked around and saw Black and white people sitting together, enjoying the same music, sharing the same emotions. It was the most civilized, beautiful evening I'd ever experienced." It made me realize that segregation wasn't protecting civilization, it was preventing it. Similarly, James Washington, a black audience member who later became a prominent civil rights lawyer, credited Billie's performance with showing him a new model for activism. Most civil rights work involves confrontation, argument, forcing change through legal or political pressure, Washington explained. But Billie showed us that sometimes the most powerful activism is simply excelling at your work, being so undeniably excellent that prejudice becomes obviously absurd. The protesters who remained outside the opera house that night had a different experience, but many of them were also changed by what they'd witnessed. They'd come expecting to prevent an assault on their values, and instead had heard testimony about the human cost of those values. Robert Kellerman, the protest leader, never publicly acknowledged being affected by the evening. But neighbors in his new town later reported that he seemed less interested in racial issues, more focused on his insurance business and family life. Several other former protesters, however, did eventually speak about how the experience had affected them. They'd expected to hear entertainment and instead had been confronted with education. They'd wanted to prevent integration and instead had witnessed its beauty. "I thought integration meant chaos," one former protester told a reporter years later. "But the most chaotic thing about that night was us, the people outside shouting and throwing things. The people inside were peaceful, dignified, civilized. We were the ones disrupting civilization, not protecting it." The Chicago Civic Opera House began regularly hosting integrated performances after Billie's concert. The venue's management discovered that diverse audiences were not only peaceful but profitable. Shows featuring black performers often sold out, drawing music lovers from across the region. Within 2 years, most major venues in Chicago had quietly integrated their audiences. Not because of legal requirements or political pressure, but because it was good business and because the fear of integration had been proven unfounded. Other cities began following Chicago's example. Venue owners who'd been afraid of hosting integrated events saw that it could be done successfully, that diverse audiences could enhance rather than threaten their businesses. The music industry itself was transformed. Record labels began marketing black artists to broader audiences, recognizing that racial barriers were often artificial, rather than based on genuine market preferences. Jazz, in particular, benefited from this shift. The music had always been integrated at its core. White and black musicians had been collaborating informally for decades. But the success of events like Billie's Chicago concert made it socially acceptable for this integration to become public and official. Young musicians of all backgrounds began seeking out opportunities to play together, to learn from each other, to create music that transcended racial boundaries. The integrated jazz scene that emerged in the 1950s and 1960s had its roots in moments like Billie's September performance. But the most important legacy of that evening was the demonstration that art could be a form of activism. Not aggressive or confrontational activism, but activism through excellence, through dignity, through the simple insistence on being fully human in the face of those who would deny that humanity. Billie Holiday never intended to become a civil rights leader. She was a singer who wanted to sing songs for people who wanted to hear them. But by refusing to be intimidated, by maintaining her dignity, by using her art to speak truth about the human experience, she became something more powerful than a political activist. She became an example of how to live with integrity in the face of hatred. The protesters outside the Chicago Civic Opera House came to prevent integration. Instead, they witnessed its power. They came to stop change. Instead, they accelerated it. They came to silence a voice. Instead, they amplified its message throughout the country. In the end, the most effective response to their hatred was not hatred in return, but the continued creation of beauty. The most powerful answer to their fear was not fear, but courage expressed through art. Billie Holiday sang songs. That's all she set out to do on September 23, 1949. But in doing so with excellence, with dignity, with truth, she proved that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply being undeniably good at what you do, regardless of who tries to stop you. The legacy of that night lives on in every artist who refuses to be silenced, every performer who chooses dignity over confrontation, every musician who believes that art can change hearts in ways that argument cannot. It reminds us that the most powerful response to hatred is often the simplest, continuing to create beauty in spite of those who would prefer a world without it. That September evening proved something profound. That a single voice singing truth can be stronger than 1,000 voices shouting lies.